Silence has never actually been empty. That's the first thing worth understanding before anything else gets explained. Because most people, including most avoidants themselves, treat silence as an absence, a nothing, a gap where communication used to be. But for an avoidant standing on the receiving end of a silence that has finally, unmistakably changed character, silence is not nothing. It's the loudest, most devastating message they will ever receive, precisely because it can't be argued with, deflected, or managed the way words always could be. What follows is an explanation of exactly why this particular kind of silence lands so differently, why it terrifies in a way that shouting, crying, or pleading never quite manage to, and what it actually reveals about the psychology of someone who spent an entire relationship treating distance as a tool, only to discover, too late, that distance can be turned back on them by someone who finally learned to use it too. Anyone listening who has gone quiet after a long stretch of trying, who has stopped responding, stopped explaining, stopped offering the kind of access an avoidant partner grew comfortable receiving without ever quite earning, deserves to know this clearly and immediately. That silence is being felt. It is landing. It is doing something on the other end that no amount of previous pleading ever managed to do. This isn't a guess or a hopeful reassurance. It's a fairly predictable consequence of how avoidant psychology processes the specific absence of pursuit, once that absence becomes total. To understand why silence carries this particular weight, it helps to first understand what an avoidant has spent the entire relationship quietly relying on, often without ever consciously acknowledging it. Every avoidant relationship tends to develop an unspoken rhythm, distance offered by one person met with reaching from the other. This rhythm becomes so familiar that it eventually functions almost like a physiological expectation. The avoidant pulls back, and somewhere in their nervous system, a background assumption forms that the pulling back will be met with some form of continued effort, a message, a question, an attempt to understand, to fix, to close the gap that was just created. This assumption isn't something an avoidant consciously decides to hold. It becomes embedded through repetition, the same way any predictable pattern eventually stops requiring conscious thought and starts operating automatically, beneath awareness. This is precisely why sudden, sustained silence disrupts an avoidant so profoundly. It isn't simply the absence of contact. It's the collapse of a pattern their nervous system had quietly come to depend on, without ever admitting the dependence existed. And nervous systems, whether they belong to avoidance or anyone else, tend to respond to disrupted patterns with alarm, regardless of whether the disrupted pattern was actually healthy or sustainable to begin with. It's worth noting, briefly, that not every avoidant experiences this process with identical intensity, because avoidance itself exists on a spectrum, and the specific flavour of avoidance someone carries tends to shape how visibly this internal unravelling actually surfaces. Someone whose avoidance is more deeply defended, more thoroughly practiced over a lifetime, may take considerably longer to consciously register any of what's being described here, their defences simply more efficient at delaying the reckoning. Someone whose avoidance developed more as a reaction to specific circumstances, layered over an underlying capacity for connection that was never fully extinguished, may move through these stages more quickly and with more visible discomfort along the way. Neither version is more or less real than the other. The underlying mechanism remains the same in both cases. What differs is simply the thickness of the wall the silence eventually has to work its way through. This distinction matters mainly because it discourages using a specific timeline as evidence of anything. Someone whose avoidant partner seems to take an unusually long time to show any sign of this internal process shouldn't necessarily interpret that delay as proof that nothing is happening beneath the surface. It may simply reflect a more entrenched, more heavily fortified version of the same underlying pattern, one that requires more sustained silence before the usual defences finally run out of room to manoeuvre. It still matters to distinguish, early on, between two kinds of silence, because they are experienced by an avoidant in almost opposite ways, and confusing them leads to a great deal of unnecessary second-guessing for anyone currently living inside this exact situation. The first kind of silence is reactive. It's silence used as a weapon, a punishment, a strategy designed to provoke a reaction, to force the avoidant to feel something, to prove a point through withholding. This kind of silence, however understandable the impulse behind it might be, tends to be temporary, charged, and, crucially, still emotionally entangled with the avoidant. It says, implicitly, I am still invested enough in your reaction to control what you receive from me. Avoidants, whether consciously or not, can often sense this kind of silence for exactly what it is, and while it might produce discomfort, it rarely produces the deeper, more destabilizing fear being described here, because reactive silence still contains an implicit demand for a response, which means the connection, however strained, remains active. The second kind of silence is entirely different, and it's the kind that actually creates the effect this entire exploration is centered around. This is silence born not from strategy, but from genuine depletion, the natural, unforced result of someone who has simply run out of whatever reserve of hope or energy used to fuel their attempts to reach across the distance an avoidant kept creating. This silence isn't performed. It isn't designed to provoke anything. It simply exists, quietly, as the honest byproduct of exhaustion finally outweighing hope. And this is the version of silence avoidants find almost impossible to misread, because unlike the reactive kind, it carries no implicit demand at all. There's nothing to respond to, nothing being asked for, no emotional hook left dangling for the avoidant to eventually take hold of. It simply is what it is, someone who stopped, not because they wanted to send a message, but because there was genuinely nothing left to send. This distinction deserves real emphasis because it explains why some people spend months or years using silence as leverage, hoping it will finally produce the reaction, the chase, the desperate return they've been waiting for, only to find it doesn't work. While others, who stop entirely and completely, without any strategic intention behind the stopping, unintentionally produce exactly the effect that was never achievable through calculated withholding. Real silence, the kind rooted in depletion rather than tactics, tends to be far more powerful precisely because it isn't trying to be powerful at all. For anyone listening who worries that their own silence might have started as strategy and only later become genuine exhaustion, there's no need to untangle that distinction perfectly in order for this explanation to still apply. What matters most isn't the precise motivation behind the first few days or weeks of silence. What matters is its current character, whether it still carries an implicit demand for a particular reaction, or whether it has settled into something quieter, less charged, less contingent on producing any specific outcome at all. It's this settled, undemanding quality that avoidants find genuinely unsettling, because it removes the very thing their nervous system has learned to rely on, without ever admitting the reliance existed. Now consider what actually happens inside an avoidant once they begin to sense this shift, because the process unfolds in a fairly specific, recognizable sequence, even though it rarely gets acknowledged or discussed openly by the person experiencing it. The earliest signal is usually a kind of disorientation that doesn't yet have a name attached to it. Something feels different, but there's no immediate event to explain why. This disorientation often gets misattributed to something else entirely: stress, tiredness, and unrelated frustration, because the actual cause, the growing absence of a familiar rhythm, hasn't yet been consciously identified. During this period, an avoidant might notice themselves unconsciously checking for something, a message, a sign, some small piece of the old pattern reasserting itself, without fully registering what they're checking for or why. This checking behaviour tends to increase gradually rather than appearing all at once, a slow accumulation of small, almost involuntary gestures toward reconnection that go unanswered. As this unanswered checking continues, something more specific begins to emerge, a mounting unease that starts attaching itself, however reluctantly, to the actual source. This is often accompanied by a wave of minimizing thoughts, attempts to explain away the silence as temporary, situational, unrelated to anything meaningful. These explanations serve an important psychological function. They allow the avoidant to delay the more threatening realization sitting just beneath the surface, that this particular silence might not be like the others, that this one might not resolve itself the way distance always used to, eventually, once enough time passed and the usual rhythm reasserted itself. This is the stage where old habits often resurface, sometimes in slightly modified form. An avoidant, accustomed to being the one who creates distance, suddenly finds themselves in the deeply unfamiliar position of being on the receiving end of it. And this reversal tends to produce a specific kind of discomfort that has less to do with missing the relationship in a straightforward way, and more to do with a sudden, unwelcome loss of the control they'd grown so used to holding. For someone whose entire relational strategy has depended on managing the distance between themselves and everyone they've loved, discovering that the distance is now being managed by someone else entirely is deeply destabilizing, regardless of how that destabilization ultimately gets expressed. It's worth pausing here to offer something important to anyone listening who might feel a flicker of guilt at the idea of causing this kind of discomfort in someone they once loved deeply. This discomfort is not cruelty being inflicted, it is not manipulation, and it does not require justification or apology. What's being described here is simply what happens, psychologically and predictably, when a person who has spent an entire relationship being the one with the power to create or dissolve distance finally encounters someone who has learned to hold that same power for themselves. There is nothing wrong with finally, quietly, choosing to stop reaching. In fact, for many people, this choice represents the healthiest decision available after an extended period of reaching towards someone who rarely reciprocated the effort. Discomfort experienced by the other person as a result of that choice is not evidence that the choice was wrong. It's simply evidence that the choice mattered. As this stage progresses, minimization typically becomes harder and harder to sustain. There's only so long a person can tell themselves that a particular silence is ordinary, temporary, situational, before the evidence accumulating against that story becomes too significant to ignore. This is usually when a more active phase begins, one marked by a kind of urgency that often surprises the avoidant themselves, because urgency requires exactly the kind of unguarded emotional exposure they've spent a lifetime avoiding. This urgency doesn't always express itself the same way, and it's worth naming a few of its more common forms, without turning this into a checklist of behaviours to expect or wait for, since waiting for any specific reaction risks keeping someone tethered to a situation they've already, wisely, decided to release. Sometimes this urgency shows up as an attempt to re-establish contact, tentative at first, testing whether the silence will break in response, often escalating if the initial attempt goes unanswered. Sometimes it shows up less directly, in behaviour visible to people other than the person who's gone quiet, restlessness, distraction, a noticeable change in mood that others might notice even if the underlying cause remains unspoken. Sometimes, particularly for avoidants who have spent years building elaborate intellectual explanations for their own emotional patterns, this urgency shows up as a sudden, almost compulsive need to understand what's happening, turning the situation into something to analyse and solve, rather than something to simply feel and sit inside of. Whatever specific form this urgency takes, its underlying function remains consistent. It represents an attempt to regain the sense of control that silence has taken away. And this is where something crucial deserves to be understood clearly by anyone currently on the giving end of this silence, wondering whether to interpret any resulting urgency as proof of a genuine, lasting change of heart. Urgency, created by discomfort, is not the same as insight created by reflection. An avoidant scrambling to restore a familiar rhythm is not necessarily the same as an avoidant who has actually done the internal work required to behave differently once that rhythm is restored. This distinction matters enormously because so much unnecessary pain gets created by mistaking one for the other, by interpreting frantic reaching as transformation, only to discover, once contact resumes and the underlying panic subsides, that very little has actually changed beneath the surface. There's a metaphor worth sitting with here, because it captures something important about how this kind of urgency tends to function. Imagine someone who has spent years walking along the edge of a cliff without ever fully acknowledging the danger, relying entirely on an old, sturdy guardrail they never thought to check or maintain, simply trusting it would always be there, because it always had been before. Then, one day, without warning, the guardrail is quietly removed. The immediate reaction isn't reflection on why the guardrail existed in the first place, or gratitude for the safety it provided for so long without ever having to think about it. The immediate reaction is panic, the sudden, visceral awareness of how close the edge actually is, how unprotected the position actually feels, once the thing that had been silently protecting it is gone. That panic is real. It's also not the same thing as suddenly developing a genuine, lasting relationship with heights, exposure, and edges. It's simply the natural, urgent response to losing something that had been quietly, invisibly, doing a great deal of protective work all along. This metaphor helps explain why silence produces such a specific, intense reaction in avoidance, without requiring any assumption about whether that reaction reflects real change. The reaching that follows silence is often simply an attempt to get the guardrail back, not necessarily an indication that the person reaching has developed any new capacity to walk safely near the edge without one. It helps to go further into what actually separates panic-driven reaching from something more substantial, because this distinction tends to be the single most important piece of information for anyone trying to decide how to respond if and when an avoidant does eventually break the silence they've been met with. Panic-driven reaching tends to share several recognizable qualities, regardless of the specific words or gestures used to express it. It tends to be urgent, arriving with a kind of intensity that feels disproportionate to whatever small opening initially prompted it. It tends to focus heavily on securing an immediate response, prioritizing the restoration of contact over any deeper acknowledgement of what led to the silence in the first place. And it tends to fade quickly once contact is re-established, replaced almost immediately by a return to the same patterns of distance and inconsistency that created the need for silence to begin with. Genuine change, by contrast, tends to look almost disappointingly unremarkable by comparison, at least at first. It doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic declaration or an overwhelming display of emotion. It tends to show up as small, consistent, unglamorous shifts, sustained over meaningful stretches of time. A willingness to tolerate discomfort without retreating from it. An ability to sit with someone else's pain without needing to immediately fix, minimize, or escape it. A track record, built slowly and without fanfare, of following through on stated intentions rather than simply expressing them convincingly in a single charged moment. This kind of change is far less exciting to witness than the dramatic reaching that often accompanies panic, but it's also far more reliable as an actual predictor of whether anything has fundamentally shifted. This distinction matters because it protects against one of the most common and painful mistakes people make when an avoidant partner finally breaks a period of sustained silence. The intensity of a reaction is not evidence of its durability. In fact, the two are frequently inversely related, the most dramatic, urgent, overwhelming responses often being the ones least likely to sustain themselves once the acute discomfort driving them subsides. Anyone tempted to interpret dramatic urgency as proof of lasting transformation deserves a gentle reminder that drama and durability rarely travel together, particularly for someone whose primary coping strategy has always been avoidance rather than steady, sustained engagement. There's also something worth saying about the timeline required to actually distinguish between these two possibilities, because impatience at this stage tends to work against clarity rather than toward it. Panic resolves relatively quickly, usually within a matter of weeks, once the underlying threat of permanent loss either resolves itself through renewed contact or fades through enough time passing that the nervous system recalibrates around the new reality. Genuine change requires a much longer runway to become visible, because it has to be tested against ordinary, unremarkable circumstances. The kind of routine, daily friction that doesn't carry the urgency of crisis, but does require the same consistency crisis temporarily produces. Anyone genuinely curious about which category a particular response belongs to would be wise to resist forming a conclusion too early, since early urgency looks identical, whether it belongs to lasting change or to temporary panic. Only time reliably tells the two apart. There's a physiological dimension to all of this worth explaining, because the discomfort being described isn't purely psychological in the abstract sense. It has a genuine bodily component that helps explain why this experience feels so disproportionately intense to the avoidant living through it. Human nervous systems are wired to respond to unpredictability and loss of control with measurable physiological arousal, elevated heart rate, disrupted sleep, a persistent, restless energy that doesn't resolve through ordinary means of self-soothing. For someone who has spent years relying on distance and control as their primary coping mechanisms, encountering a situation where neither distance nor control is available produces exactly this kind of physiological activation, and it tends to intensify the longer the silence continues without resolution. This matters because it explains why avoidants in this situation sometimes behave in ways that seem uncharacteristically erratic, uncharacteristically emotional, uncharacteristically unlike the calm, controlled persona they typically present to the world. The body, in this case, is simply responding the way any body responds to a sustained state of unresolved threat, regardless of how sophisticated or intellectualized a person's usual coping mechanisms happen to be. Intelligence and self-awareness don't exempt anyone from basic physiological stress responses, and avoidants, despite often being remarkably skilled at appearing unaffected, are not exempt either. It's worth noting too that this physiological activation tends to be far more intense, specifically because it can't be discharged through the usual channels. Ordinarily, when an avoidant feels this kind of internal pressure building, they have a reliable outlet available: distance itself. Pulling back, creating space, retreating into solitude has always been their primary strategy for regulating overwhelming feeling. But in this specific situation, distance is no longer something they're choosing. It's already been chosen for them, which means the usual outlet is unavailable, and the pressure that would normally be discharged through retreat instead has nowhere to go. This is part of why this particular kind of discomfort tends to feel so unfamiliar and so intense to avoidants specifically. They are, in a sense, encountering their own primary coping strategy being used against them, and discovering, often for the first time, how little they actually know about processing overwhelming feeling without it. There's something clarifying in understanding this physiological piece for anyone currently holding the silence and wondering whether what they're doing is somehow unfair or excessive. It isn't manufactured suffering. It's simply the predictable result of removing a coping mechanism that was never healthy or sustainable to depend on in the first place. And encountering that result doesn't require guilt, because the removal wasn't done to cause harm. It was done to stop absorbing harm that had been flowing in one direction for far too long. It's worth going a little deeper into what this minimization actually sounds like internally, because naming it specifically helps explain why it can take so long for an avoidant to move past this stage into anything more honest. The internal narrative tends to follow a familiar, well-worn groove, something along the lines of assuming the other person simply needs space of their own, or is reacting to a bad day, or will eventually come around the way they always have before, once enough time passes. This narrative isn't necessarily dishonest in an intentional sense. It's simply the mind reaching for the explanation that requires the least amount of immediate emotional reckoning, a reflex built from years of successfully avoiding exactly this kind of reckoning, by waiting it out until circumstances resolve themselves without requiring any real change on the avoidance part. What makes this particular silence different though, and what eventually forces this narrative to collapse, is the simple passage of time without any of the usual signs that would normally validate it. If someone genuinely just needed a few days of space, some sign of that eventually surfaces, a shorter message, a small gesture, some flicker of the old rhythm reasserting itself. When none of that arrives, when the days stretch into weeks without a single signal that the old pattern is resuming, the minimizing narrative starts to require more and more effort to sustain, until eventually it simply can't hold up against the accumulating weight of evidence suggesting otherwise. This realization tends to arrive slowly, in pieces, rather than all at once. And it often triggers a kind of retrospective reckoning that avoidants rarely allow themselves to experience while a relationship is still active and available. Memories that were previously filed away as unremarkable suddenly take on new weight. Moments that felt ordinary at the time get replayed with a clarity and significance they never carried in the moment they actually happened. This retrospective reevaluation is one of the more painful ironies embedded in avoidant psychology. The full emotional significance of a relationship often only becomes accessible once that relationship's continuation is genuinely, believably at risk. Which means the person doing this retrospective reevaluating is almost always doing it too late for it to change anything about how the relationship was actually experienced while it still existed. For anyone listening who has wondered whether their silence would ever actually be felt, whether stopping the endless cycle of initiating, explaining, and softening would register as anything more than one more thing the avoidant could simply wait out, here is something worth holding on to. This retrospective reckoning, however delayed, however unfair in its timing, tends to be one of the more reliable indicators that silence, real silence, the kind rooted in depletion rather than strategy, actually works in a way that continued reaching never did. Not because silence is manipulative or designed to produce this effect deliberately, but because it removes the one variable an avoidant's entire coping structure depended on without ever consciously acknowledging the dependence. There's something worth turning toward now, something that has nothing to do with the avoidant at all, and everything to do with the person actually holding this silence. Because so much of what's been described so far centers on decoding someone else's internal experience. And that decoding, while useful, can inadvertently keep attention fixed on the wrong person entirely. Holding real silence, the kind rooted in depletion rather than strategy, requires something significant from the person doing it, something that deserves recognition independent of whatever effect it eventually has on anyone else. It requires tolerating an enormous amount of uncertainty without collapsing back into the old pattern of reaching first, explaining first, softening first. It requires sitting with the discomfort of not knowing how the silence will be received, whether it will be met with growth, indifference, or something in between, without needing that uncertainty resolved immediately in order to feel steady. This is an enormous act of internal regulation, often achieved after years of the opposite pattern, where discomfort was managed by immediately reaching outward rather than staying anchored inward. Anyone who has managed to hold this kind of silence, even imperfectly, even with moments of doubt or temptation to break it, has already demonstrated a level of internal steadiness that likely didn't exist earlier in the relationship, back when every silence from the other side was met instantly with anxious efforts to close the gap. This matters because it reframes the entire situation away from a waiting game centered on the avoidant's eventual response, and towards something that has already, quietly, been accomplished regardless of what happens next. The nervous system capable of holding boundaries under this kind of pressure, without needing external validation to sustain them, is a fundamentally different nervous system than the one that existed at the beginning of this relationship, when every distance was met with immediate, anxious pursuit. This shift, whether or not it's ever consciously named or celebrated, represents a form of healing that has nothing to do with whether the avoidant ever changes, reaches back, or acknowledges any of what's been described throughout this exploration. It's worth being honest too about how difficult this particular kind of silence tends to be to sustain, because acknowledging that difficulty offers a form of validation that's easy to overlook amid all this analysis of the avoidant's internal experience. Choosing not to reach out to someone still loved, even after everything that led to this point, requires resisting a pull that operates on a level far deeper than simple willpower. It requires overriding deeply ingrained patterns patterns that likely developed long before this particular relationship even began. Patterns rooted in whatever taught a person, at some earlier point in their life, that love needed to be earned through relentless effort, through being the one who always closed every gap, soothed every rupture, and absorbed every inconsistency without complaint. Breaking that pattern, even temporarily, even imperfectly, is genuinely difficult, and anyone doing it deserves to hear that difficulty acknowledged, rather than assumed to be effortless simply because it's the healthier choice.